Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Elipse Natural Nitrogen Macerated Processed Panama from the Picky Chemist. And there's the bag right there. And the Picky Chemist, based out of Chaudfontaine, Belgium. And this makes back-to-back the Picky Chemist reviews, having reviewed the Iridescence, the washed carbonic macerated processed Panama from Chemist and Savage in our previous video. But I did save this review for last, as our previous experiences with the Picky Chemist were more positive with their natural processed coffees than their washed ones. So I'm curious to see if that theme held true for these two as well, as this right here is day 48. The recipe we went with for this coffee was very close to our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. But once again, with this coffee, I did have to go 2 notches more fine on the grind than normal to say that the grind on this one is even more fine than you would typically go. Now, roast profile for this coffee, I also should have alluded to this in our previous review. While the Picky Chemist is one of the lightest roasting coffee roasters in the entire world, these two Panamanian coffees were both omni-roasted, as I think that's the only thing that they offered for these high-end coffees. So even with that, it is still on the very light side of things, as this is still a very light coffee, even with the processing and by most standards and metrics. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 22, first impression, and once again, through the V60, and the biggest takeaway I had right at the start was that there was significantly more clarity than I might have expected given the processing on this one, as it wasn't necessarily acting like an overly processed coffee, remaining well above average in terms of clarity. The aroma itself lent the slight fermenty aspect to the cup in terms of a red fruit forward profile, but there was significantly less fermentiness within the cup itself, as it was pretty sweet and offered a very well-defined raspberry aspect. And I was kind of, unsure about this coffee at the start when I did see that there was a red fruit note on it. Given the processing, I kind of assumed that we might get a much more heavy type of coffee, but that wasn't necessarily the case from this first try. So we'll see if that theme continues, as on day 26 we opted for the Chemist, and it continues to offer well above average clarity with some really nice structure and definition to the cup that was reminiscent of Panamanian geishas in general. So that was very positive, as there was a slight floral citric quality in a very pronounced manner, with the red fruits also well articulated, offering some great clarity to them as well. So this second impression with the Chemist definitely yielded some very positive results with some extremely high sweetness to the coffee. And that made it one of the sweetest coffees we'd had from the Picky Chemist up to this point. So this was a very nice day. We continue on to day 29, opted for the April brewer, and the cup continues to offer above average clarity. And I think I keep going back to that because I fully expected this coffee to maybe be a little bit too much. We did review that Costa Rican coffee that did seem to offer a little bit too heavy of an aspect for it. And given the processing, I just kind of assumed it would go this way, but it really didn't, as it continues to offer cleaner red fruit aspects with tremendous definition to them. The listed raspberry note complemented by an abundance of citric qualities in a classic Panamanian geisha sense. So another really nice day as I continue to pull out some really nice attributes from this coffee. Day 34, higher temperatures and a more fine grind, and the coffee was a little less enjoyable for me, as it was nice off brew. However, it seemed to cool off in a slightly more fermenty sense, and it opened up a lot more in the listed bergamot-like sense as well. So those two things weren't necessarily things I was looking for, though it did offer a fair bit of those cleaner red fruit aspects right off of brew again. So positives to take away nonetheless. Day 37, same adjustments to the Chemist, and it continues to remain pretty consistent with not too much different between the brew methods. It's slightly more vibrant in the V60, though you're getting a little bit more clarity in the Chemist, so that's kind of the trade-off. The clarity is near washed level, with much more of the red fruits coming through in a cleaner sense, and I know I keep going back to that in the notes, but every time I drank this coffee, I was still just kind of surprised at how clean it was coming out. Much more of a sweeter citric orange as well, so this was a pretty nice day. Day 40 through the V60 with our starter recipe and a more fine grind. And this is by far the best the cup had been to this point. And I said, I think I'm just going to settle on this. This coffee as a whole has been consistent, but this one right here, offering what it is probably the best way for me to continue with it going forward, as it's essentially reminiscent of what I would describe as a strawberry lime jello. It really had this tremendous sweetness to it, but this excellent definition as well. It's pretty sweet with nice clarity. That's all I really want, is sweetness with clarity. Plenty of red berries and a sweeter citrus, wonderful clarity, and an excellent improvement as the cup does cool down. Best day by a distance, really seemed to enjoy this day a lot. Day 43, same recipe from the previous day, and it remained consistent, and that's why I just decided to stick with it, because the consistency that I was experiencing from this coffee with these adjustments was enough to yield the positive results I was looking for. And I think I got pretty close to what this coffee is supposed to be, as there was an abundance of fruits with emphasis on the red fruit aspects again. And for me, it was reminiscent of, like I said, punchy jello. So raspberry jello, strawberry jello, but in general, this kind of red jello aspect to it in a very sweet sense. Citrus, a little dialed back, which works for me. This is a little bit more of a clean, sugary, jammy stone fruit aspect to it on this day. So thinking a little bit more in lines of something like an apricot. A bit of a lasting finish to an otherwise very sweet cup. So I think at the end of the day, happy story. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. I'll save the cleanliness for last on this one. We'll start with the finish, level 4. Yeah, so I do have to say that my assumptions for this one was that it might be a little overbearing, but the finish is very even. So massive credit to the picky chemist on this one. I don't have any complaints or issues to it. Given that this coffee was very sweet and it offered a citric profile to it, I fully expected it to maybe be a little bit heavy in that sense, but it really wasn't in any capacity. So finish at level 4 seems right and perfect for me. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, and this one right here, I do have to say, is on the higher side of the level 4. So that's why I didn't necessarily enjoy putting the last coffee at that level 4, mostly because I said these two coffees aren't created equal in terms of the sweetness. This one is much more sweet, and I couldn't quite justify putting this coffee at a level 5 because it's not necessarily to that extent. I don't want to insinuate that this coffee is overbearing, because by all means, it is not overbearing in any sense. The sweetness is just on the higher side, which I really appreciated and enjoyed. It was my favorite part of this coffee. So higher side of the level 4 for this one, really nice. Acidity, level 4. And again, it was a little bit of a surprise, but the 3 coffees that we had from the picky chemist, I was drinking them all side by side, and I found it to be so interesting that they all seemed to offer a fair bit of brightness. But once again, I do think a lot of that has to do with the fact that you do roast on a very light side of things, so I fully expected a fair bit of the brightness to be coming out from that nonetheless. Florality, level 4. It's not something that we mentioned too much, mostly because I think a lot of the other attributes did dominate the conversation within it, because those attributes were a lot more flavorful and pronounced. Though there was a little bit of this red floral aspect to this coffee, and I think maybe it could have been interchanged with a lot of the red fruits that were present within it from the start. So level 4, I do agree with that. I do think that there's a fair bit of that in this cup, maybe a little bit of an underrated quality within it. Berry fruit, level 4. I think this is the one that I could say might have been on the verge of that level 5, might have been kind of pushing it. But usually when I do chart something at a level 5, it's for one of two reasons. It's either extremely clean and well-defined to the point where very few other things come even close to matching it, or because it's overbearing and too heavy. But this one right here, I feel like with all its definition and with as pronounced as it is in the coffee, I didn't want to put it at that level 5 to once again insinuate that it was overbearing in this cup, because while it was well-defined and pronounced, it wasn't to the extent where it justified that level 5 mark. Higher side of the level 4, definitely the most pronounced fruit characteristic within this coffee. Citrus fruit, level 4. Once again, we're getting a little bit of a bergamot-like attributes to it, though this one a little bit more flavorful and pronounced than in the washed version of this coffee. So I do have to say that that was an interesting part of it. And then the stone fruit at a level 4. While I've only briefly mentioned it, I do have to say that it was pronounced enough to the point where it's justified a level 4 mark for me. So just like the sweetness between these two coffees not necessarily being on ideal and similar footing, it's kind of the same thing with these fruit components, as the berry fruit is the most pronounced, and then you get the citrus, and then you get the stone fruit. But all 3 of them were present enough in this coffee to justify that level 4 mark, so that's why all of them are at that level 4. And then we have one level 3, which is the caramel, and I usually put a very sweet kind of candied component to it in that caramel, as I wouldn't necessarily say that there was an abundance of brown candied characteristics to this one at all. Rather, a little bit more of that candied aspect. Most specifically, what I've kind of been harping on is that jello-like feeling to this one. So that's what that is within this coffee. And then we have, I think, one other thing I really want to discuss, because yeah, we have a couple of level 2s, but specifically the body being at that level 2. So for me, I found it so interesting that the natural nitrogen macerated was a little less heavy in terms of the body than the washed was. But once again, making these tasting wheels side by side, I just noticed there was a little less body in this coffee. So that's why it bumped down to the level 2, and why the other one being at that level 3 was such a huge surprise to me. And of course, the last thing we must discuss is the cleanliness being at that level 4. And I wanted to save that for last because it's the first thing I mentioned. And I think I mentioned it in pretty much every single day that we discussed this coffee, because it surprised me. And once again, going into it, fully expected it to be a little too overbearing for me, but at no point would I say that the fermentiness was too heavy. If anything, I would say that there were times the washed was acting a little bit more in that sense, as it had a little bit more of that grainy quality. It had a little bit more of that fermenty quality. Whereas this one here, I worried very early on that it was going to trend in that direction, given that it was a red fruit forward coffee. But credit to both the producer as well as the roaster that it never got to that stage. So I can say that this is a little bit more ideal with what I would look for these more processed coffees, because if you can keep them from going over that line, being too heavy and overbearing, and offering some great clarity to it, then I'm going to be a big fan of that coffee. So credit to them on that. And that's why I'm much more happy with this one being at that level 4, as if anything, I felt like this one might have been a little bit more justified at that level 4 than the Iridescence. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one right here is definitely my favorite of the Picky Chemist coffees that we have reviewed on this channel so far. And I do find it interesting that a lot of the times what people keep suggesting to me from this coffee roaster are the natural processed ones, most specifically the natural processed Ethiopian Geshas that the Picky Chemist has released, which I can kind of see it. So I am having a little bit of difficulty seeing what a lot of other people are seeing when it comes to their wash processed coffees. I won't lie about that. For me, they're a little bit too tame and kind of lacking the sweetness and flavor that I typically look for from those coffees. I see some other things, but I think that those are other things that a lot of people are looking for from their coffees, where it's not necessarily my sort of thing. But when it comes to their naturals, they're much more in line with what I'm looking for. And this one is a great indicator of that, as it offered great sweetness, but also great clarity, great definition, and a wonderful fruit profile to it, as well as the florality. So it did hit on the 4 marks that I'm looking for specifically within these coffees. But once again, offering this great sort of sweeter profiled fruit component to this one with a very clean sense was a big winner for me, and that's why I enjoyed it as much as I did. Obviously, it's in the second most stacked or the most stacked category we have. So while this one is one I've really enjoyed from the Picky Chemist, I think the only big takeaway I have from it is that those are probably the types of coffees that I'm going to enjoy from this coffee roaster, and that's very rare. I think a lot of people know that I typically enjoy wash processed coffees significantly more than more processed coffees from pretty much every coffee roaster. So I think that's what stands out about this coffee roaster for me. At least that's been my experiences with the 2 natural or slightly more processed coffees, of course, with the exception of that Costa Rica coffee that we've reviewed on this channel. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you like the really sweet red profiled coffees, but not in the sense where they're overbearing, maybe a little bit more clarity and cleanliness to them in general, this one's a great fit for you. And since I enjoy that, that's why it was a great fit for me. So I really seemed to enjoy this one. That's the first place I'd go, but it also offers some great fruit depth to it as well in terms of the citric and stone fruit direction. So there's a lot that can be taken away from this one. You can experience a fair bit of it, a little bit of depth and complexity in general. So the best direction I can point somebody towards, of course, also keep in mind the very light profile of these coffees, but also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Elipse Natural Nitrogen Macerated Processed Panama from the Picky Chemist. Thank you for watching.